The glass doors of the Congressional Judicial Committee chamber hissed open at exactly 9:47 a.m., and Karoline Leavitt stepped through the threshold into what would become the most consequential hearing of her career. The biometric scanner beside the entrance, a sleek black monolith that had been installed just weeks earlier, immediately began its silent assessment. Red lights flickered across its surface, like digital synapses firing. The machine's optical sensors traced the contours of her face, analyzed her gait, measured the micro-expressions that betrayed her emotional state. Within 2.3 seconds, the verdict appeared on the main screen in stark, clinical text: behavioral risk, high. Probability of disruptive action, 87.3%. The room fell silent, not the respectful quiet of a formal hearing, but the stunned silence of witnesses to an execution. Nobody expected what would happen next. Not the assembled committee members who had grown comfortable with their new technological oracle. Not the gallery of reporters who had come expecting routine testimony. And certainly not Regina Voight, the government's chief technology prosecutor, who had just watched her perfect system brand her opponent as a threat before she had even spoken a word. But Karoline Leavitt had come prepared for war. The hearing that morning wasn't just about legislation, it was about the future of human agency in an age where algorithms could predict your actions before you even knew you were going to take them. The Online Predictive Behavior Act represented the most radical expansion of governmental surveillance powers since the Patriot Act, wrapped in the seductive promise of preventing crime before it occurred. Before we dive into the explosive testimony that would shake the foundations of digital rights in America, subscribe to witness the moments when individual courage collides with institutional power. Because what you're about to see isn't just a legal battle, it's a fight for the soul of democracy itself. The chamber around her was a study in controlled intimidation, designed to make witnesses feel small and vulnerable. Karoline Leavitt had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that her appearance before the Congressional Judicial Committee would either establish her as a credible voice in the fight for digital rights or mark her as a dangerous extremist who couldn't be trusted with serious policy discussions. At 29, she carried herself with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate the intersection of technology and politics, a space where most of her colleagues feared to tread. Her background was unconventional for a politician: a computer science degree from MIT, followed by a law degree from Harvard, followed by years of experience as a digital rights advocate who had watched the slow erosion of privacy protections with mounting alarm. The Clean Politics Act had been just the beginning. Her real mission was far more ambitious: to establish legal frameworks that could protect human autonomy in an age where artificial intelligence could predict, manipulate, and control human behavior with unprecedented precision. She had spent months building her case against the Online Predictive Behavior Act, consulting with privacy experts, constitutional scholars, and former intelligence operatives who understood the true implications of what Regina Voight was proposing. Regina Voight commanded the room from behind her presentation podium like a tech evangelist delivering a keynote address to true believers. Her background was a masterclass in the revolving door between Silicon Valley and government power: MIT PhD in artificial intelligence, followed by a decade at Deep Sentinel Corporation developing predictive algorithms for law enforcement, followed by her current position as the government's chief technology prosecutor. She represented everything that terrified civil libertarians about the militarization of artificial intelligence, a brilliant mind that had convinced itself that human freedom was an acceptable price to pay for algorithmic efficiency. The committee members arrayed before them were a mixture of aging legislators who barely understood email and younger representatives who had grown up with smartphones but had never seriously considered the implications of living in a world where every digital interaction was monitored, analyzed, and fed into predictive models. But the real power in the room wasn't human at all. It was the network of interconnected AI systems that had been quietly integrated into the congressional complex over the past year, systems that monitored speech patterns, analyzed facial expressions, and generated real-time assessments of every person who entered the building. The session began with procedural formalities, but Regina Voight cut through the bureaucratic pleasantries with the efficiency of someone who had grown impatient with human inefficiency. "Miss Leavitt," she said, her voice carrying the clinical precision of a diagnostician delivering a terminal diagnosis, "do you believe the government should wait for danger before it acts, or prevent it before it happens?" The question was carefully crafted, designed to force Karoline into either appearing naive about security threats or endorsing the very surveillance state she had come to oppose. It was a rhetorical trap that had been tested on focus groups and refined through multiple iterations. But Karoline had been expecting this exact question. "What you're proposing isn't prevention," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "It's preemptive punishment. You're asking us to criminalize thoughts that haven't been expressed, actions that haven't been taken, and intentions that exist only in the imagination of your algorithms." The murmur that rippled through the gallery was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of an audience realizing they were witnessing something more than routine testimony. Voight's response was swift and condescending. "We act before hurricanes make landfall. We quarantine before epidemics spread. We evacuate before volcanoes explode. This is simply the logical extension of preventive governance into the digital realm." The comparison was devastating in its simplicity, and Karoline could see several committee members nodding in agreement. Natural disasters were predictable through scientific observation. Human behavior, Voight was arguing, was equally predictable through algorithmic analysis. "The difference," Karoline said, stepping closer to her microphone, "is that hurricanes don't have constitutional rights." Karoline opened her leather binder with the deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. She hadn't come to this hearing to argue philosophy or engage in abstract debates about the nature of human freedom. She had come armed with data, legal precedent, and documentation that would expose the true nature of Regina Voight's proposal. "The First Amendment doesn't come with a prediction clause," she began, her voice gaining strength as she moved into the arguments she had rehearsed countless times. "Neither does the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, and certainly not the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process." She turned to the main screen and began displaying slides that had been prepared with the obsessive attention to detail of a prosecutor building a case for murder. "You're using algorithms as judges, and their accuracy is not just debatable, it's demonstrably flawed." The first slide showed a heat map of AI prediction failures across major metropolitan areas. Teachers flagged as potential terrorists for assigning George Orwell's 1984 to their students. Journalists marked as security risks for researching government surveillance programs. Children classified as future criminals for playing video games with violent content. Each example was accompanied by documentation, court records, privacy commission reports, and testimonies from the victims of algorithmic bias. Voight interrupted with the dismissive tone of someone who had grown tired of having her expertise questioned by amateurs. "Statistical outliers, edge cases that exist in any predictive model." Karoline was ready for this objection. She had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment, knowing that Voight would try to minimize the human cost of her technological utopia. "Outliers," Karoline's voice sharpened. "These outliers represent 23 zero-documented cases of AI misclassification in the past year alone. Teachers who lost their jobs, journalists who were placed on watch lists, children who were flagged by school administrators as potential threats to their classmates." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a 12-year-old girl named Sarah Chen. Sarah was flagged by an AI system because she wrote a short story about a zombie apocalypse for her creative writing class. The algorithm interpreted metaphorical language about destroying the world as a literal threat assessment. She spent 3 months in counseling before the classification was overturned. The room had grown completely silent. Even the committee members who had been sympathetic to Voight's position were now staring at the screen with visible discomfort. Voight attempted to regain control. "These are growing pains in any new technology. The benefits far outweigh the temporary inconveniences. Our models show a 73% reduction in online harassment, a 45% decrease in hate speech incidents, and a 62% improvement in early intervention for potential suicide risks. At what cost? Karoline demanded. And who decides what constitutes a threat? Your algorithms? Your corporate partners? The same technology companies that profit from collecting and analyzing our data? She turned to the committee clerk. May I submit an internal document obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests? Judge Mercer, the session's moderator, raised an eyebrow. He had been expecting routine testimony, not a full-scale assault on the technological foundations of modern governance. Proceed. The document that appeared on the main screen was a simple, internal memo, dated 18 months earlier, but its implications were devastating. The header read, Deep Sentinel Corporation, Internal Strategy Meeting, Confidential, and the content was a series of bullet points discussing the monetization of predictive behavioral analysis. But it was a single sentence, highlighted in bold at the bottom of the page, that changed everything. Freedom is overrated if profit is guaranteed. R. Voight, Chief Technology Officer. The gasp that echoed through the chamber was audible even over the humming of the air conditioning system. Reporters in the gallery began frantically typing on their phones. Committee members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the political implications of what they had just witnessed. Regina Voight's face transformed from confident authority to barely controlled panic in the span of seconds. The clinical precision that had defined her testimony evaporated, replaced by the defensive posture of someone who had just been caught in a lie. This memo was circulated during the initial testing phases of your predictive justice model, Karoline continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just landed a decisive blow. It was sent to potential investors who were considering funding the expansion of surveillance capabilities into civilian populations. Voight's microphone flickered, whether from technical malfunction or deliberate sabotage. No one could tell. When she finally managed to speak, her voice had lost its earlier confidence. That document was taken completely out of context, she said, but the defense sounded hollow even to her own ears. Judge Mercer leaned forward, his expression grave. Miss Voight, do you deny authoring this memo? The pause that followed was pregnant with implications. Everyone in the room understood that the next words would determine not just the fate of the Online Predictive Behavior Act, but potentially the future of AI governance in America. The memo was written during a brainstorming session, Voight finally admitted. It was hyperbolic language used to illustrate the economic benefits of predictive intervention. Karoline's response was immediate and devastating. Then give us the full context. Show us the complete document. Let this committee see the economic projections, the cost-benefit analyses, and the risk assessments that led you to conclude that constitutional rights were an acceptable sacrifice for corporate profits. The silence that followed was no longer procedural or respectful. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed the collapse of an entire worldview. Judge Mercer called for a recess, but the damage had already been done. The carefully constructed narrative that had supported the Online Predictive Behavior Act, that it was a necessary tool for protecting American citizens from digital threats, had been exposed as a corporate strategy disguised as public policy. Reporters flooded out of the chamber, their phones already buzzing with editors demanding copy and producers scheduling emergency broadcasts. The hashtag Predictive Justice began trending within minutes, accompanied by screenshots of Regina Voight's memo and clips of Karoline's testimony. But the real impact wasn't in the immediate media coverage. It was in the phone calls that began flooding congressional offices within hours of the hearing's conclusion. Constituents who had never heard of the Online Predictive Behavior Act were suddenly demanding to know why their representatives were considering legislation that would allow corporations to profit from surveillance disguised as public safety. The committee reconvened 3 hours later, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Committee members who had arrived that morning prepared to rubber stamp another piece of national security legislation were now asking pointed questions about corporate influence, algorithmic bias, and the constitutional implications of predictive policing. Regina Voight's final testimony was a masterclass in damage control, but it was too late. The foundation of trust that had supported her proposal had been irrevocably shattered. The session ended without a vote. The Online Predictive Behavior Act was quietly shelved, pending further review and consultation with constitutional scholars and privacy experts. Karoline stood on the courthouse steps that evening, facing a sea of cameras and microphones that had materialized as news of the hearing spread across social media. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Capitol building, creating a dramatic backdrop for what would become one of the most widely shared political moments of the year. "This wasn't just about me," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. "This was about you, about your data, your voice, your right to think freely without being judged by algorithms designed to maximize profit rather than protect privacy." In the days that followed, the ripple effects of her testimony spread far beyond the confines of congressional hearings. University campuses erupted in debates about digital rights and algorithmic governance. Protesters gathered outside the headquarters of major technology companies, carrying signs that read, "Don't silence me before I speak," and "My thoughts are not your product." Regina Voight disappeared from public view, quietly returning to the private sector where she could continue her work without the scrutiny of congressional oversight. But her vision of predictive governance didn't disappear with her. It simply went underground, where it could evolve and adapt without the inconvenience of public accountability. The Online Predictive Behavior Act was officially withdrawn 6 months later, but Karoline understood that this victory was temporary. The forces that had created the legislation, the intersection of corporate interests, government surveillance capabilities, and public fears about digital security, hadn't disappeared. They had simply learned to be more subtle in their approach. She returned to her office that night with a single thought echoing in her mind. They'll try again. They always do. Because the fundamental tension between human freedom and algorithmic control hadn't been resolved by her testimony. It had simply been postponed, pushed back into the shadows where it could continue to evolve without the inconvenience of public scrutiny. The question that would define the coming years wasn't whether artificial intelligence would continue to shape human behavior. It was whether democratic institutions could adapt quickly enough to prevent that influence from becoming control. And in the quiet moments between congressional sessions and media interviews, Karoline Leavitt was already preparing for the next battle in a war that would determine whether the future belonged to human agency or algorithmic determinism. Was justice served, or was it just paused? The answer, like so many things in the digital age, would depend entirely on what happened next. The battle between human rights and algorithmic control isn't just a political debate, it's the defining struggle of our digital age. When corporations can predict our behavior better than we can predict it ourselves, the question isn't whether we're free, but whether freedom has any meaning at all. Karoline's victory was just one skirmish in a war that will determine whether democracy can survive the age of artificial intelligence. Subscribe now to follow the next chapter of this technological revolution, because the algorithms are already watching, and they're learning from every click, every view, every decision you make. Tell me in the comments, should AI systems be allowed to predict and prevent human behavior, even if it means sacrificing privacy and due process? And if you were flagged by an algorithm as a potential threat, would you trust the system to correct its mistake? Or would you fight back like Karoline did?